Hello everyone. Good morning, and thanks so much to Sandy and Jirka and Tomasz and everybody who has been involved with putting this together. So I think it's a fantastic center and great to have this effort and the resources to work on this very important topic for 5 years, right? So that's really excellent. I think it's a very important topic, and Mike's just set the scene for all the many issues that include so many unresolved topics that are still to be addressed. And so even though we've learned a lot over the last century and more, there's still so much more to discover and prevent from more invasions from happening. And so I should mention my co-authors here. So this is something that I've worked on quite a bit with Eckehard and also with Sandy, and I have to admit that I haven't given them a whole lot of time to contribute to the presentation, but they have. And so then just a few examples here of particularly dramatic invasions. Not all non-native pests and pathogens and plants cause impacts. In fact, the majority is relatively benign, but then there are a few that can really cause dramatic impacts, and we've already had an introduction, so I won't dwell on this, but here you see a few really pretty severe examples. Kudzu vine is found in many countries, and often it really smallest forest vegetation. Ash dieback, Mike also mentioned it just before, has really had a massive impact in Europe. In Switzerland, for example, ash fraxinus species have declined from, I think, the fourth most abundant tree species to now fifth or sixth, so it's declining massively. It's a slow death, but the majority of trees eventually die. It looks like there's some resistance, so it's not all lost, but certainly ash, even without emerald ash borer arriving, which will happen sooner or later, is not looking in good shape. And then in North America, the spongy moth, that's also been a pretty big impact, really. It's killed a lot of oaks there also, but even just defoliation and various other impacts it's causing, it's pretty dramatic. And there is like a very, very long list of cases like this, so, and I won't expand on this any further. But of course, so international trade, the movement of goods between continents especially, is sort of the key driver of this. And you see here this massive container port in Shanghai, and people say we should inspect all this and prevent that things escape from what's shipped around with these containers. I mean, you would need like a huge army of inspectors to actually inspect all this. What's happening is typically that they open the gate, they have a look, and even in countries where all containers are inspected, that's often as far as it goes. So, I mean, it's virtually impossible. Like, you can't manage this huge volume of trade. And clearly this, among a few other pathways, is really the big driver. Some people say invasions are all caused by climate change. And of course, climate change is a sort of mitigating factor, especially in the movement of species that wouldn't normally find a suitable climate, and also it causes stresses that makes plants, for example, more susceptible to invaders. But these kinds of invasions have happened long before climate change has started to have an impact. And so it's really misunderstanding that you can read in the literature, in quite a few papers, that climate change is the main driver of invasions. And it's not, so far at least. It's international trade, especially between continents. And so I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. And Sandy has already shown this global phenomenon. These are forest insect invasions over time. And so, we see very similar trends in different continents. So here, just data from the US, from Europe and New Zealand. And this is continuing more or less steady. I mean, in Europe, it looks like an exponential increase, but that's probably also because in Europe, they've caught on a little later to this being a problem. So it really started only maybe in the 1990s with the DAISY program, that there was more attention to this issue, whereas in the US, where admittedly also it's been a bigger issue for a longer time, there was a lot more awareness. So I think some discoveries of non-native insects, for example, in Europe have happened quite some time after they've already been here. So I think the increase is not necessarily exponential, more kind of a steady increase. And it's still happening despite all our efforts to curb this increase in non-native insects and pathogens, and also plants, whereby plants we have to kind of put in a slightly different category. I think a lot of plants also accidental escapes that come along as seeds with other shipments and so on, but the majority probably were introduced intentionally for horticulture or just ornamentals, and many are here already, and it's just a matter of time until they escape from cultivation. So because there's just a huge number of non-native plants growing everywhere, like in New Zealand, for example, there's already a greater number of non-native plants that are naturalized, so escaped from cultivation, than native vascular plants, which is something that you need to think about. And in terms of number of plant individuals, not yet, but the species out there has already exceeded the number of native species, which is phenomenal. And there are still a lot more that haven't escaped yet, that are already there. Yeah, so one question, and of course it's the topic of my talk, is biotic resistance. And the key question here is basically, is the invasibility of forests influenced by the composition of forests, by the diversity of trees? And this is like an extreme example, this Pinus radiata plantation in New Zealand. It's basically a monoculture, although there is an understory of native plants and also a lot of exotic plants, but looking from above, it looks like a monoculture, and in terms of what's actually actively planted, that's what it is. And of course, like if you arrive there as a non-native insect that likes pines, or as it were in a few rarer cases also as a native species that's managed to colonize this, you're having a great party. There's nothing that stops you, and especially if there's a lack of natural enemies and the conditions are good, then pests can chomp through this and cause big problems. And New Zealand's been relatively lucky, so there's been the case of the Syrinx wood wasp, which has been pretty dramatic there, but that's sort of gone away as a combination of growing trees with less stress, introducing biocontrol agents. There's a bunch of pathogens that are pretty dramatic, but this is still the sort of dominant forestry paradigm in New Zealand. And some say we don't need multiple tree species, we focus on just one. It's we put all eggs in one basket, but it's just one basket and we can look after it. So, but I think that only works so long, so there's probably more problems on the way. But yes, so is a natural forest of mixed tree species like the one on the right, is that more resistant to invasions? And so that's what I'm going to look at. And this not a new concept. In fact, this has been around for a while, and it was mainly Charles Elton who has been credited with coming up with this biotic resistance or biodiversity invasion resistance hypothesis. And so, yeah, just a word about Charles Elton, because yeah, he was a professor of animal ecology at Oxford University, and he's worked a lot on ecological theory. So I think a lot of what we talk about now, in some form, it's already been kind of coming from his thinking. So sometimes it seems like we haven't made quite so much progress. But yeah, also interesting is he was the founder and first editor of the Journal of Animal Ecology. So he's also been contributing to publishing other people's work and advancing the topic. And yeah, so in 1958 he published this book, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. And so in it, that is basically the origin of the biotic resistance hypothesis. And so basically his idea was that species-rich communities are more resistant to invasion. And so that book also apparently, or at least by Ricciardi and McIsaac, it was coined as the book that began invasion ecology. And so it wasn't for some time, though, that the number of publications on this topic really took off. And it looks like the 1990s was kind of the breakpoint where the number of publications on invasion ecology really kind of rose. But so I think Charles Elton had a key role to play here in this field. But at first it was more sort of observational and theory without a lot of mathematics behind and not so much empirical evidence. And so David Tillman did a lot of work in grasslands, not in forests, but he had these experimental plots like you see them here in the picture up there, where he varied the number of plant species, and this was all replicated in these plots. And then he looked at, among other things, which species invaded in relation to the number of plant species that were present in these plots. And so he came up with a few kind of theoretical observations. And so when he looked at resource concentration here in relation to species diversity, he hypothesized that basically with increasing diversity, there's a decline in this resource concentration. And as a result, also, there should be less invasibility because of this decline in resources. With increasing species diversity, there should be fewer invaders because the forest becomes less, or grassland in this case, less invasible. So yeah, we also now know about a few mechanisms that would be behind this, so we don't just take it as a fact that that's something that may happen. We've looked into various kind of drivers and mechanisms by which this could happen, and so a key one is that there are fewer unoccupied ecological niches when you have a richer habitat, species-richer habitat. It doesn't necessarily need to be species, can also be other types of parameters that are relevant here. But let's just stick with species because it's a simple concept. Then quite a few studies have shown that there are more and a greater diversity of natural enemies in more species-rich habitats. And so that's likely to be another key driver, because any new arrival has to face some natural enemies that are already present that may help with this resistance against the invasion. In the case of herbivores, then this is also because the host plants are becoming less dense. So imagine you have very many plant species, then of each plant species there is less than if you have a monoculture, say. So that's this resource dilution that a herbivore arriving doesn't have like everything in front that's a host. There's only one here and there perhaps, so it's harder to colonize that. And then the host plants may also be less apparent physically or chemically by volatiles emitted by non-host plants that are masking the presence and location of the host plants, for example. So these are some of these factors here. And just to illustrate that a little more, I've crafted some images here of low diversity habitat and higher diversity habitat. And so if we look at plant invasions, then it's quite obvious that there would be a lot of empty niches, like bare ground that hasn't been colonized yet by a plant. So if you have just one plant species there, for example, then there's a greater chance that additional plants can colonize and find a suitable seedbed and so on. And the same goes then for trees, and there's various other circumstances that would play a role. But you can see that a diverse forest here, in this case of multiple species, that it would be harder to invade that. And especially in the case of forests, because forests tend to be less invaded than open habitats and shrublands where there's more open space and less shade. So at the same time also, there are likely to be more natural enemies in the high diversity habitat. And so again, this is something that may provide some level of resistance to an invader coming in there. And so just some credit to the author of this particular species. And yeah, so, but what's the data like? And so this is a fairly recent study published in 2023. This is from not quite global, but from many countries, forest inventory plots. And these authors looked at nearly 3,500 forest inventory plots. And then as soon as there was one species that was non-native, they considered that invaded, and the others were not invaded. And they looked at this in relation to native richness here on the x-axis. And you can see the more native richness in these forest plots you have, the fewer non-native plants in this particular case, or trees rather, you get. So this is from a rather large data set, and the authors have also tried to correct for a whole bunch of potentially confounding factors that may play a role here. So this is pretty good evidence for biotic resistance occurring in forests, and especially for tree invasions. And so a little bit of theory here, how many authors and quite a few studies have looked at this kind of relationship between native species richness and exotic richness. And so the biotic resistance hypothesis would predict that this should be negative. So the more native richness you have, the less exotic. So this should go down. But interestingly, yeah, so more resistance to invasion. But interestingly, there are also quite a few cases where there's no kind of sign of this, and there's a neutral relationship. And there are also quite a few cases where this is a positive relationship. So the more native species you get, the more exotic ones you get. And there are like particular cases where this has been studied across different scales. And so I had a PhD student, Lolin Wasinyo, a few years ago, and Song Lin also contributed to this. I don't know, yeah, he's here today also. And so we used the native forest plots from New Zealand. There's nearly 1,000 of them. And we excluded highly modified areas where you could have had all kinds of reasons for non-native plants being there. We excluded edge plots because we didn't want to look at edge effects. We corrected for latitude and climatic variables and various other things. And so we plotted this just all native plant species richness against exotic richness. And lo and behold, there was a positive relationship. So apparently no sign of biotic resistance. But interestingly, when we looked at the effects of native tree richness, this is like the second graph here, then indeed, like the more native tree species there were, then the fewer exotic ground tier richness was there. So these are plants on the ground. And so there's a clear sign that, in fact, when you have a greater diversity of tree species, then it seems to be harder to invade these areas for additional plants coming in, especially non-native plants. And so it seems like it's important to keep in mind not only the simple number of plant species, native or non-native, but also in which tier they are. And so is it a tree or is it ground cover? And so I think sometimes it's too simplistic to just take species richness per se without considering what these species are and what they're doing. And so I think the effect of shade provided by trees and having a diversity of trees, which probably reduces the ability of herbaceous plants, and very many of the herbaceous plants actually are not shade tolerant. So this is like a key factor that we think plays a role here. And yeah, if you look at just native ground tier richness, then there's no sign of that. So this was kind of interesting to go into more detail and to look at these potential confounding factors that may influence this relationship. But as far as insect invasions are concerned, there are a few studies that have shown that tree species richness at the plot level, like here on the x-axis, can influence, in this case, the amount of defoliation caused by this chestnut gall wasp, which is an Asian species that was introduced, I think, in the early 2000s, or probably a little earlier, in Southern Europe. I think it began in Italy, and then detected, but probably present for a little while before that. And yeah, so it causes these galls, these knobbly bits here, which in some cases prevent the forming of leaves. And so basically it's a kind of defoliation. And so in this particular study here, you can see that the more tree species there were at the plot level, the less defoliation there was. So this is also a kind of biotic resistance, you could say. Here's another example. This is slightly complex. It also involves a natural enemy. So it's the case of Pinus nigra in the island of Corsica. Now, the issue is that Pinus nigra has a scale insect, Matsucoccus pini, and it has a natural enemy. So that particular scale insect is controlled by this natural enemy and it's not causing a lot of harm. Then there's also Pinus penaster, maritime pine, which was reunited after a very long time of not having been together with its host. This scale insect, Matsucoccus fetodi, invaded Corsica. And it was observed that in the mixed stands, when both nigra and penaster, maritime pine, were present in the stands, that there was much less impact of this introduced non-native scale insect in Corsica. And so with further study, it was determined that, in fact, it's the presence of nigra and the natural enemy of its scale insect that then also controls the invasive non-native scale insect on Pinus penaster, on maritime pine. Whereas if you have pure maritime pine, then you don't get that, and there's no natural enemy there that causes this. And this scale insect, when it sucks, it's usually on the picture here. Scale insects aren't particularly nice insects. They're not very pretty. They're just these blobs that sit there in the bark and suck on the trees, and they inject a venom that basically kills the trees. And so you see these maritime pine trees here that are dying as a result of this. And so here in the figure there, you see the more Pinus nigra there is in the mixed sand, the less there is of this, oops, what happened now? Oh, thanks. Yeah, so another clear sign of biotic resistance, in this case mediated by the presence of a natural enemy. So we can see there are cases where we can demonstrate the mechanisms pretty clearly of natural enemies being involved in cases of providing biotic resistance. And then there are many other cases, and Sandy and Songlin and others have worked on this also with a very large data set from the US, which there's a tremendous wealth of forest inventory plots, like 130,000 or so were included in this analysis. For insect pests, there aren't a lot of plot data on individual small plots, but they have county level data. So the counties which are below the state level, but relatively large areas, and sometimes like they are the size of a small country in Europe. But so they have the number of insect pests, non-native insects occurring at the county level. And so when you have a very large data set, what you see is that when you have increasing tree diversity, you get initially an increase in the number of non-native insects. So it looks like no biotic resistance, and in fact facilitation. The more trees, the more insects. But when you increase tree diversity further, then it actually starts to decline. And so this is a hump-shaped relationship where, in fact, if you look at this more thoroughly and you have high tree diversity, then you do actually get biotic resistance eventually. And what was also interesting was that the presence of hosts or non-hosts also had a key importance. So the more trees of the host plants were there, the more this increased, and non-hosts, the more non-hosts, then there were also fewer of these non-native insects present. So that's another important aspect here, that both like tree diversity over a larger scale of tree richness, and also the presence of hosts and non-hosts, so which suggests that greater sort of phylogenetic diversity is also important, because if you plant, say, 3 species of pines, there's less phylogenetic diversity than have you say an oak and a pine and let's say a juniper, whatever. So you get the picture. And so a more recent study that we've just published with my postdoc Marco Basile, this is based on data from Europe, and this is actually plot-based data for both plants, vascular plants and insects. And so this is from the same location, and using a range of methods, but sort of compatible. This was a byproduct of a EU cost action project, and so it just so happened that it turned out to be suitable also for an analysis of the presence of non-native insects, or specifically beetles in this case, in relation to vascular plant richness. And so interestingly, we also observed this hump-shaped relationship that was shown in the Guo et al. Paper that I just showed before. And also interesting was that the managed forests we categorized between managed forests that had some kind of human management, planting or whatever, and unmanaged forests that were sort of left alone and maybe not pristine. This is very rare in Europe these days. But so we also found this hump-shaped relationship, that in cases where you have very high vascular plant richness, so this is not just trees but all vascular plants, then you also get fewer of these non-native beetles. So another indication that there is biotic resistance for non-native insects at higher levels of diversity. So just as a reminder, you can have these negative native exotic richness relationships and neutral ones and positive ones. And there's a spatial scale effect, and this was put together very nicely by Jason Fridley and colleagues quite a few years ago by now. But basically they plotted from very many studies that they looked at, and mostly of plants, but and mostly not of forests, but there were like all kinds of studies included. And they looked at this relationship, this native exotic richness relationship, in relation to the scale of the study. So from very small, like 10 square meter plots, to 1,000-meter plots here, 10 to the minus 1 hectare, to landscapes and watersheds, counties, states, provinces, or entire biomes. And then if it's a negative relationship, then basically it's biotic resistance. If it's positive, then it's facilitation, more native, more exotic, right? So they found that at small scales, and these were data from both experiments, like the ones of Tillman that I showed earlier, and also just observational studies, they found that the majority actually supported the hypothesis of biotic resistance occurring. Whereas when they looked at larger scales, then the larger the scale, the more positive the relationship became. So they hypothesized that heterogeneity between habitats, so if you go from a small area to a bigger area, all sorts of things change, and you wouldn't expect to find the same plant species. You find more and more species area relationships and so on. Bigger the area, the more species you find. You find more native species, but also greater sort of opportunity for non-native species to colonize areas. So habitat heterogeneity is likely to be a key driver here when you look at larger scales. So it's very important at what scale you look, and whether you have small scales or large scales, and what the sort of mechanisms are that are ultimately responsible for the shape of the native exotic richness relationship. And finally, they also looked at very large biome scale. And for example, when you compare temperate and tropical or even boreal habitats, you find that there's, by and large, less invasion happening in tropical habitats in tropical regions, which also are in very many cases and generally more diverse. So tropical environments tend to be the most species rich, and apparently like in 1 hectare of Amazonia you only find one individual of a tree species. So I'm not sure whether it's a myth, but apparently really there's like huge richness of tree species, for example. Yeah, so this is something that we also looked at with the New Zealand data. And so we had a look at various kinds of relationships and what we would expect there in terms of the effects of native species richness, which I already spoke about, but also species competition and habitat heterogeneity. And so what we got was, when we combined these plots that were on an 8x8 kilometer grid, when we combined groups of up to 4 in a 16x16 kilometer grid, or up to, what does that make? A 16, I think, in a 32 kilometer grid, and not sure what that would be on the 128 kilometer grid, but you get the picture, I think. And so by doing this, by combining plots at larger spatial scales, we could see what would happen if we expand the scale and included more plots, which we would have expected also to have increasing heterogeneity as you sort of include more and more of these plots. And so we found that, in fact, I'm not showing the single 8 kilometer plot data anymore here, which I showed earlier, but so just in terms of native tree species richness, it was still slightly negative at the 16 kilometer grid. And as soon as we went to the larger one, it sort of became increasingly positive, apparently. Unfortunately, it was no longer significant, because when you combine these plots, then you also lose replicates. So yeah, it wasn't quite as apparent, but at least the trend kind of confirmed the pattern of increasing spatial scale and increasing diminishing of the biotic resistance that we saw when we looked at the individual plot level. And so then, as for heterogeneity, we had 2 types of heterogeneity that we looked at. There was rainfall heterogeneity. There are areas in New Zealand where you get less than 500 millimeters rainfall per year. There are areas where you get more than 10,000, very wet. And so this is like a key driver that actually has massive impacts on the sort of plant species composition. And if you've been to New Zealand, you may have noticed a different plant species composition between East Coast and West Coast and the South Island. It's like day and night. And the other one was temperature heterogeneity, which we have down here. And in both cases, we did suffer in 3 out of 4 cases, so the larger scale here, from this sort of reduced number of replicates that you can get when you combine plots. But in any case, it sort of confirmed this kind of increasing change in the shape and the sign of the relationship. So yes, heterogeneity of habitats is probably a key driver that explains this kind of change in the native exotic richness relationship from negative to positive. So it's very important to look at scale. And so here's a study that Sandy led a few years ago. And so again, insect data at the county level. So it's not small individual scale plots, even though the plant richness comes from plots, but then extrapolated or combined to the county level. And what you see firstly here, this is the number of tree genera at the county level. And what you see is that the eastern US are a lot richer than the center and the western US, where there's just a lot more tree genera. Very similar picture for species also, but genera tended to be the stronger effect in this particular study. And so interestingly, what you also see is that this sort of eastern area, especially the northeast, is also the most invaded, where you have the most non-native forest insects that have colonized there. And there's also not as many, but like on the west coast, there's also quite a few. Now, partly this is driven by where people live, where trade has happened over centuries, which is more concentrated. So this is the area that was also the most industrialized, the most colonized initially, and there's been the longest time for species to become established. But basically, what this shows is that there's a positive relationship. So the more tree genera in this case, the more non-native insects you get. But again, it's like at this larger spatial scale where perhaps this is what you would expect. So yeah, and perhaps biotic resistance does happen at the singular plot level, but it's masked by these habitat heterogeneity drivers and perhaps also other factors. And one key factor that's different between plant invasions and insect invasions is that the concept of empty unoccupied niches is fundamentally different between insect invasions and plant invasions. If you have few plants, you have many open niches where other plants can colonize. If you have many trees, you actually have more niches for insects, because if you have like a pine and an oak and a juniper, you can have pine, oak, and juniper insects colonizing, whereas if you have only pines, you can only get pine insects plus a few generalists, which are less fussed about what sort of tree they feed on. But that's the minority. Like most tree-feeding insects are actually more or less host-specific, as are the pathogens, I believe. So yeah, and so if we go back to this diagram here, and we have our low diversity habitat and the high diversity habitat, when we look at empty niches or available niches that can be colonized, then yes, there's more room for non-native insects to colonize, because there are more potential host plants, more niches when you have. So this is a fundamental difference between effects on plant invasions and insect invasions. However, when you look at the role of dilution of host plants, then you would expect this should provide some level of biotic resistance, as does the greater availability of natural enemies, which you tend to get in species-rich forests. You tend to find more and a greater diversity of natural enemies, and also there are more competitors. There are likely to be more other insects already feeding in these various niches, which may also be an impediment to colonization. So yeah, and ultimately then it's the outcome of the interplay of these facilitation and resistance drivers that will define ultimately whether it's a positive or a negative outcome and what the sign of the relationship is. And so to conclude, so there's both experimental and observational evidence of biotic resistance in forests, and for both plant and herbivorous insect invasions. There are a whole bunch of mechanisms that are possible, and many of them have been proven, although the relative importance and role of each of these varies from system to system. And yeah, so there are multiple compounding factors that modify outcomes. They include the volume of trade and arrivals, propagule pressure, and so on, but also where pests come from, whether they find suitable hosts or not, which is one of the key drivers why natural forests in New Zealand are relatively uninvaded, apart from a few mammals. But it's actually remarkable how few non-native insects are in forests in New Zealand, in native forests, contrary to what you find in non-native forests of trees from the Northern Hemisphere, which have been reunited with very, very many of their old associations of, and so you see some similar effects in Europe. Habitat heterogeneity is clearly a key driver of the sign of the biotic resistance or facilitation kind of outcome. So spatial scale is really important to keep in mind, and what that does to heterogeneity. So there are some key differences between plant invasions and insect herbivore invasions, because tree diversity increases niche availability. So and that sort of moderates the biotic resistance that may be provided by some of the other mechanisms. And then, yeah, so there are relatively few data on insect invasions at small scale. There's like a tremendous amount of data on plant invasions from the thousands and thousands or maybe millions of forest inventory plots that have been kind of gathered over the years. For insects at small scales, it's like a few individual studies, and so that makes it kind of harder to kind of combine a large data set and look at kind of in a meta-analysis way or so. Yeah, but there's more and more generated, and we have a study in preparation that's probably coming out maybe next year. That's so quite a few cases that we've studied in more detail now in Europe. And so yeah, at very high tree diversity, we would expect to have biotic resistance. And so from an applied point of view, that also means that not only for that, also for various other reasons, but we should diversify forests. We should get away from forest monocultures, and wherever possible also planting native trees, because non-native trees do in one way or another also kind of contribute to the movement. Like if you move plant propagative material around the world, even if you take great care, there's always something, even if it's just like an endophyte in the microbiome that we didn't know about, or as it were in the case of kiwi fruit vine disease, that it was introduced with pollen because they didn't realize that the bacterium that's causing this disease can be imported with pollen. And in New Zealand, kiwi fruit growers import pollen for pollination because there isn't enough pollination happening naturally. So you have to walk around kiwi fruit orchards and blow pollen into them. And so if you bring in your pollen from an area that has this kiwi fruit vine disease, you're in bad shape. Anyway, so yeah, these differences in sign or strength of effects among orders or trophic groups is one of several unresolved and open questions that could potentially be addressed in a working group here at the center. So, but there's like a whole bunch of other potential topics, and yeah, so there's especially for insect and also pathogen invasions, there's really still a lot of study that can be done to resolve this invasion paradox and a few other kind of related questions. So thanks very much.